Howdy, it's Kyle with the second installment of the Geography of Sports Markets. A while back I posted a video in this series where I took a look at metropolitan areas in the US and how that population correlated with the sports markets and which teams had the largest reach of fans outside of their metro area. And also in that video I took a look at what were the small market teams. So you hear things about small market franchises. I took a look at the metropolitan areas to see which ones were actually the smallest. So I'll leave a link in the description if you want to check out that video. In this video, I'm going to take a look at population changes in the past 50 years and how that might affect the look and makeup of the four major pro sports leagues in the US. In 1970, the teams were located in what were the largest metropolitan areas in the US at the time, but there's been a big geographic shift in population since then. In 1970, a disproportionate number of the major metros in the US were either in the Northeast or the Midwest, but in the past 50 years, there's been a big geographic shift in population as folks have moved more south and more west. So I want to take a look at if these leagues were to start today in an alternate universe, what cities would get some of these teams. I'm going to start off by showing a spreadsheet of the 1970 and 2020 US Census. The two columns on the left are the top 50 metro areas in 1970, and the two columns on the right are the top 50 combined metro areas in 2020. So the first thing you'll probably notice is just how the numbers are so much larger now. In 1970, there were 30 metro areas with a population over 1 million. Right now, there are over 60. But to give a few examples of geographic changes in population, take a look at Detroit, 5th in 1970, now it's 14th. Cleveland was 8th in 1970, and now it's 21st. Pittsburgh went from 10th to 25th. St. Louis from 12th to 24th. Milwaukee 19th to 33rd, and there are several others like that. In the opposite direction, Atlanta went from 20th to 10th. The Tampa Bay area went from 28th to 15th. Phoenix from 31st to 13th. And then look at Salt Lake City from 48 to 26. So this really highlights the geographic shift in population from the Midwest and Northeast to the Southeast and West. So I'm going to take a look at the four major pro sports leagues in the US. I am a fan of Major League Soccer, but the league didn't start until the 1990s. So I'm going to be looking at the four major leagues that were around in 1970. I'm going to start off by talking about the NFL, the National Football League. In 1970, there were 26 teams. The Colts were the Baltimore Colts before they moved to Indianapolis. The Cleveland Browns later moved to Baltimore and became the Baltimore Ravens. And the current Cleveland Browns are a more recent expansion team. The Patriots were known as the Boston Patriots at the time. You had the Houston Oilers, who later moved to Nashville and became the Tennessee Titans. The Cardinals were the St. Louis Cardinals before they moved to Phoenix and became the Arizona Cardinals. The Raiders were in Oakland, then they moved to Los Angeles, then they moved back to Oakland, and they've since moved to Las Vegas. The Los Angeles Rams moved to St. Louis and then moved back to Los Angeles. And the San Diego Chargers have also since moved to Los Angeles. In 1970, the New Orleans Saints was the smallest market in the league. It was the 27th largest metro at the time. So now let's take a look at what the NFL would look like if it started today. I'm going to start by taking a look at the AFC. The AFC North division will be the exact same. You look at the AFC East, Orlando is such a large market, there would be a team there. In the AFC West, Portland has gotten a lot bigger in the past 50 years, and San Diego would have a team, but it wouldn't be the Chargers. And the AFC South, a lot of Texas in there. So this is quite a different look for the AFC. Let's take a look at the NFC. The NFC Central would have a new team in St. Louis. The NFC East would be all teams that currently exist. And as a side note, I do think Commanders was a good choice for a name for the Washington team. But you look at the NFC West and it looks the same. And the NFC South would see a new team from Salt Lake City. And if you didn't see your favorite team in this new hypothetical NFL, well, here's why. So these are the smallest markets in the current NFL. And keep in mind, for Green Bay, I'm actually counting Milwaukee for its large metro, not Green Bay, and even so, it still isn't big enough. You look at the Buffalo Bills and the Jacksonville Jaguars, these are two teams for the past 20 years, there's been whisperings of them moving. And I remember I was a kid when they added Jacksonville to the league. At the time, I was thinking, what are they doing? This market is nowhere near big enough to support a team that isn't playing well. So we'll pour one out for these teams, and now we'll take a look at Major League Baseball. In 1970, there were 24 teams, 6 teams each of 4 divisions. At the time, the team from Washington was called the Senators, and later on the Washington Senators moved to Dallas and became the Texas Rangers. The Montreal Expos later on moved to Washington and became the Washington Nationals. The California Angels changed their name to the Anaheim Angels, and now they go by the ridiculous name, the Los Angeles Angels of Anaheim. At the time, the Kansas City market was the smallest market in the league. The metro area ranked 24th in the U.S. So let's take a look at how the American League would look if it started today. The AL West is basically the same, but I put Oakland and San Jose. When there were two teams in the San Francisco Bay Area, the second one was always in Oakland, but San Jose has since become the largest city in the San Francisco Bay Area. The AL East would be the exact same, but the AL Central is where you see the biggest changes, with Charlotte, which I think might actually get an expansion team in the near future, and again, Orlando. Looking at the National League, the NL West would have a team in Portland. The NL East would look the same, but the NL Central would have a new team in San Antonio. And that kind of goes with the trend, more teams in Texas and Florida. So let's take a look at who would the losers be if the league started today. So just like in the NFL, Kansas City and Wisconsin would lose their teams. And there also likely wouldn't be a second team in the Chicago metro area. You take a look at some of the metro areas that have two teams, such as Washington, Baltimore, Dallas, Fort Worth, San Francisco, San Jose. Those are metro areas that have two different main cities that make up the metro. Chicago just has one and traditionally doesn't have two teams for their sports except for baseball. Next, let's take a look at the NBA. This poster shows the 1969-1970 season, but there were three expansion teams in 1970, the Cleveland Cavaliers, Portland Trail Blazers, and the Buffalo Braves, who later on moved to Los Angeles and became the Clippers. Of these teams, the Cincinnati Royals moved to Kansas City, became the Kansas City Kings, and later on moved to Sacramento. The San Francisco Warriors changed their name to the Golden State Warriors. The Seattle Supersonics moved to Oklahoma City, and now they're called the Thunder. The Baltimore Bullets became the Washington Bullets, and they were that for a while, but now they're the Washington Wizards. The San Diego Rockets only lasted a few years and then moved to Houston in 1971. In 1970, Phoenix was the smallest market in the league. There was less than 1 million people in the metro area. And that was pretty forward thinking on a part of the NBA to put a team in Phoenix. It really wasn't that big of a city at the time. So let's take a look at what the NBA Eastern Conference would look like. The Central Division would look quite a bit different with teams in Cincinnati and Baltimore. The Atlantic Division would be the exact same. And the Southeast would have even one more team in Florida. And in case you're wondering about a league having teams in both Tampa and Orlando, there are over 8 million people in that Central Florida region. Orlando and Tampa are too far apart to be considered one metro, but it is a lot of people in that region, and more than enough to support two teams. Now we'll take a look at the Western Conference, and you gotta love the irony of Oklahoma City not being a large enough market to have a team, but then Seattle would. But that does point out that it isn't always just about population. Obviously, Seattle is much larger than Oklahoma City, but the team moved to Oklahoma City because that city was willing to use tax dollars to build a new arena. But this is an alternate universe type situation that I'm talking about here, where I'm only looking at the population of the market to see where these teams would be. And in the Southwest, you would have a second team in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex and a team in St. Louis. And for the Pacific, you would likely have two teams in Northern California, but Sacramento probably wouldn't have one of them. There are enough people in Northern California to support two teams, but the second team would likely be in San Jose. So that's a lot of changes for the NBA. The NBA is located in a handful of fairly small markets. And again, you're seeing Milwaukee and Indianapolis being on the outside looking in. These are two metro areas that have gone down quite a bit in terms of overall ranking of the metros in the U.S. So you may have noticed that I had a team in Salt Lake City for the NFL, but they would lose their team in basketball. And that's because the NFL has 32 teams, NBA has 30. But if the NBA were a 32-team league, there would be a team in Salt Lake City. And the last league that I'm going to look at is the NHL, National Hockey League. This is my favorite of the four major pro sports teams, but I wanted to cover it last because it's going to be a little bit different than the other ones. Hockey is more geographically dependent, as you could have smaller markets in the northern U.S. or in Canada that could support a team, while major markets in the Sun Belt might not be able to. So I won't be looking at just population numbers for the NHL. In 1970, there were 14 teams in the NHL, but there were also 4 teams in another league called the WHA, the World Hockey Association, that survived the collapse of that league, and those teams are later added to the NHL. Of the 14 NHL teams, the California Seals would later on move to Cleveland, but the team folded little after that. The New England Whalers changed their name to the Hartford Whalers, and then later moved to Raleigh to become the Carolina Hurricanes. And the Quebec Nordiques later moved to Denver to become the Colorado Avalanche. The Minnesota North Stars moved to Dallas and changed their name to simply the Stars, but there was an expansion team added to Minnesota later on called the Wild. So let's take a look at the NHL Eastern Conference. If the league were to start today, there probably would be a team in Quebec City, and instead of Columbus, separate teams in both Cleveland and Cincinnati for the Atlantic Division. For Carolina, I have them in Charlotte, even though they do actually play in Raleigh. For the Western Conference, there would be a team in Portland for the Pacific Division, and for the Central Division, you'd have a team in Milwaukee. Wisconsin would lose the 3 teams they currently have, but gain a hockey team. And why there's not an NHL team in Milwaukee right now, I have no idea. And in case you were curious, the recent NHL expansion team in Seattle is actually called the Kraken. I wish more teams would have fun names like that. And if you didn't see your favorite team, it's because they're right here. I remember when they added Vegas as an expansion team, I was thinking this market is not large enough to support a team that isn't playing well. There's a lot of fair weather in Las Vegas right now, but at some point they're not going to be good anymore, and that market just really isn't big enough to support a team that's struggling. It's kind of like Jacksonville in the NFL. When they're playing well, you can fill up the stadium, but if they're not, it's going to be empty. And I arbitrarily chose the Islanders to be the odd man out. There are currently 3 teams in the New York metropolitan area. You have the New York Rangers and the New Jersey Devils to go along with the Islanders. It's kind of strange that there are 3 teams in the New York metro area. I doubt if they started today, they'd put 3 there. And I put Florida on there, even though Miami is a big market, they just can't draw anybody there. And even though I like Nashville, it is a fairly small market, especially for a hockey team. It took Nashville quite a while to develop a good fan base. It's pretty solid now, but there was a time when there were some whisperings of relocation. So the overall theme to this video is Sunbelt states, primarily Texas and Florida, would have a lot more teams, and there would be fewer teams in some of the Rust Belt cities. So that's my look at the alternate universe and where some of these sports teams would be located if the leagues were to start today. And if you're a fan of teams from Kansas City, Indianapolis, or Milwaukee, be glad your teams have been around for a long time, because if the leagues were to start today, you probably wouldn't have any teams. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give me a thumbs up to let me know you approve, and subscribe to this channel if you're interested in learning more about U.S. geography. I'm talking about cities and counties and states and ranking them in all kinds of different categories, doing top 25 stuff, talking about cross-country road tripping. Everything I talk about comes from a little more nerdy type perspective. But yeah, thanks for watching. Geography King, signing out. Baseball. Basketball. Wiener dog, short shorts, cigarette. Sports.